I'm now porn adjacent. I run a tabletop game stream regularly with some porn stars, which you can check out with suitable precautions in place at tabletopless.org. And just know that I put as much effort into this campaign as I would any other tits or no tits. Hello lovelies. Today we're going to talk about the Starfinder book, Tech Revolution. Starfinder is a bit of an overlooked, not exactly a gem, but maybe a semi-precious stone if you want to run science fiction, but you also want to run something using the heritage of D20. It seems to just have turned into an also-ran. There's quite a lot of support out there. There's quite a lot of books out there following the sort of Pathfinder release model for the most part, which doesn't interest me, the adventure paths. But the core RPG, the systems around it and so on are all fairly solid and familiar. One thing that it did always fall down on a bit for me was the starships and the vehicles. And the Starship Rules were always okay. They worked for what they were. With the additional information on starship design, that all worked okay. The vehicle rules were a bit more sparse. There was never as much support for vehicles as there was for starships, which felt like a bit of an oversight mechanically. Because while it is presented as kind of the far future of their fantasy setting, you can easily carve out the stuff you don't like and turn it into a purely science fiction setting. Certainly there are ideas in the Starfinder books that you could transpose over to Machinations of the Space Princess, for example, or vice versa. That's the one big advantage with D20 stuff, is even if it's different interpretations of D20, it's relatively easy to port something over from one to another. But this caught my eye because it promises to deliver the same kind of customizability and options that they had for their starships across over to vehicles and to round out the technology, because the science fiction side has felt a little bit underserved, I guess. So anyway, this is Tech Revolution for Starfinder. So it follows a fairly sort of standard model for supplementary books. You've got your overview of what content there's going to be in here. Then you have character, class information, and so on. So we have a new class called the Nanocyte, which is science as magic, really. Chock full of nanites. You can do various powers and effects and so on with them. The paper doesn't feel quite the same quality as the other releases. It feels a bit thinner, not quite as glossy. I don't know how it's going to stand up to reference use quite so much. It is lighter, so you might pay a little bit less on shipping, so that's something, I suppose. So then you have sort of subclass styles and ways of playing the Nanocyte here. Biohackers are sort of combat medics who can also interfere with biology in various ways to make it more powerful, more effective, that sort of thing. Envoys fill a space allowing AIs and so on to communicate more easily with humanity. Mechanics use drones. Then you've got options for pre-existing characters. Actually, I think mechanic is one of the pre-existing character types. So just new options that are slightly more technologically oriented, shall we say, for the usual character types. There's some races in here I don't recognise, so clearly I'm missing some books somewhere. Then we get into equipment proper. We talk about various different stores and manufacturers, how they work, a bunch of new technological items, though not as many as you might have expected from a book called Tech Revolution, but hey-ho. There you go. Wheelchairs make their inevitable debut here. Lasai, when you've got both super magic and super technology, it just doesn't seem that credible to me that there would still be people who are crippled in various ways in these societies. So it's just such an obvious inclusivity tick box, and kind of insulting to people who are disabled, speaking as one. Armor expansions are welcome, including the power armor. The illustrations are pretty good throughout. Pathfinder and Associates have always been very good on their art, and there's no exception here particularly. Plus you get some new enhancements and things that can be done to you or your armor. Some new weapons, but not many. Again, you might expect a bit more, but they've got other books if you want lots of weapons, sort of armory or whatever. But there's some here. That's interesting. Relics is kind of the technological equivalent of magic items. So one-offs and prototypes and things like that. So that's nice. Some expanded demolition rules, which is helpful. Expanded hacking, again, useful. And the problem with hacking is, in most games, you have to keep track of time separately and so on. It doesn't really solve the problem, but it's nice to have the additional options here for hacking to be available. The real worthwhile part of the book is this section 3 on vehicles, where you've got the steps and so on for making your own vehicles, customizing them, improving them, and so on. But at the end of the day, Starfinder is still a D20 based game, and D20 based games are for character interaction and conflict, not vehicle interaction and conflict, and the rules always fall over when you introduce vehicles, ships, carts, cars, anything like that. They just don't cope well because the class and level system doesn't operate with those, unless you treat vehicles and so on as characters and monsters, which Starfinder did a little bit with the spaceships. With vehicles, it makes even less sense necessarily. So that is a problem with the game, with the rules, but it's so fundamental that there's no real way to overcome it. But you can compensate a little bit. Having the vehicle customization rules and the stats laid out for the vehicles and some advice on vehicle-based encounters helps mitigate the inevitable problems that arise from using a D20 system that's based on character interpersonal conflict to deal with vehicles and starships and so on. So that's useful. If you want a game that really handles the transition from characters to vehicles best, Silhouette is the way to go. You have Mechs, which everyone loves Mechs. Basically the same sort of format as the vehicle rules. You pick a sort of class level, then you modify it, add sort of templates and special capabilities and so on until you come out the other end with a full mech. They've got advice for making combiners and transformers and so on like that. So you got your bases covered if you want to do a mech-oriented campaign. Again, runs into the same kind of issue that you always run into with vehicles in D20 games. They don't fit into the class and level dynamic, but they kind of force it in there, which is a compromise that kind of works. But it's not the best option. It doesn't work as well as it should, really. But there is no good option, so you're kind of stuck there. But what can you do? You've got plenty of examples of mechs, including some more interesting and unusual ones like this mecha tree, and it goes into the way the various cultures within the Starfinder setting use mechs and vehicles and so on. Then you get some more information on companies and locations that are more tech oriented, how they're produced, how they're used, how they're viewed, all of that kind of thing, background information. If you're into the Starfinder setting rather than the Starfinder rules, you might find that more useful and interesting than I did, because I'm just interested in chomping through the rules and figuring out how they approached the various problems that I see with the D20 system. So I can't really speak to how useful that is, but I mean, it's always nice to have more background information. So there you go. That's that. It's roughly 150 pages, a little bit over. Little bit expensive for what it is, but if you're interested in these aspects of gaming and want to bring vehicles and so on into your D20 games of whatever kind, if you wanted to build fantasy mecha like Escaflowne for your Pathfinder or D&D 3.5 games, you could do that using this. If you wanted to run more of a science fantasy game, this is useful. It's a construction toolkit, really, which I always find more useful than just flat out giving you stuff, but it cannot overcome the problems with D20 when you try to take it beyond character interactions and man-to-man combat. But it does make an heroic effort to do so, and it may not bother you as much as it does me that the system is just not constructed to cope with that sort of thing. So, yeah. Style, it's a pretty book, but the construction and so on, it's not quite up to snuff that you expect from the Pathfinder crew, Paizo. A low 4 out of 5 for style. In terms of substance, even though I find some of the Galarian related stuff less useful than you might, I can't really mark it down for that, and it does present itself as more of a toolkit than anything specific, but it spends too much time on things that aren't tech related for something called Tech Revolution. So again, a low 4 out of 5. So let's call it 3.5 and 3.5. So that'll be 7 out of 10, so slightly above average. 3.5 out of 5 total because of those low 4s, really. So 3.5 out of 5. I mean, it's worth getting if you're a game designer to understand the approaches that they've given, and if you run Starfinder or any other D20 derived game as a science fantasy setting or more of a science fiction setting, you can find stuff to rip off here, or you can learn from their approaches, their successes, their failures for what you want to bring into your own game. So, it's okay. It's not brilliant. It's above average. Starfinder is a very overlooked game, in my opinion. Gets kind of lost in the mire of D20 and 5th edition derived games. And D20 is just not particularly suited for science fiction, unless you really, really mess it about. But hey, that's just my opinion. Zang. There are certain kinds of people, ale-drinking people, people who did a little too much acid in the 60s, people who wear large warm jumpers and take long brisk walks in the countryside. These people maintain that fairies not only exist, but that they are very common. They also tend to believe that fairies are a countryside phenomenon, much like casual cruelty to animals, sexual intercourse with sheep, and having an impenetrable and parochial accent. This is, of course, rather wide of the mark. Fairies have always had a strong relationship with man, darning his socks, cobbling his shoes, cleaning his houses, drowning him, marrying him, and swapping his children for malformed hydrocephalics as a bit of a jape, and otherwise aiding or demeaning the efforts of man. Fairies do not need our belief to exist, they need us and the things that we leave around. Like an urban fox or the aerial rat known as the pigeon, if they survive, they will have adapted to city life and found their niches, not in tending to flowers and trees, but in crashing computers, letting down the tyres on people's cars, and eating leftover pizza. Urban Fairy is a game of those kind of fairies, gone feral and urban, adapted to modern life. It's a comedy game of hijinks, weirdness, and strangeness, and it almost runs itself. You want Urban Fairy Pocket Edition, which is revised and updated with better art and edited writing, and it's available from post-mort.com, DriveThruRPG, and lulu.com.
Now, Bob, consider this next question very carefully. What is your one purpose in life?
To explode, of course.